Well, friends, I'm going to start tonight's program, the 102nd class, by showing you a couple of tools that those of you who have not been participating, and even some of those of you who have been participating in the earlier classes over the past 3 years, may not have been aware were there. I just assumed you did, and then I thought, well, maybe you don't, because I was getting questions from people who had participated, and for some reason, I didn't understand why they didn't know where things were. So let me begin by simply sharing my screen and going to to Firefox, which is the browser I use, and then going to the site where these classes are. And of course, you have all that, and you probably know that. Now, what you may not know, and it's simple, but is that if you click videos instead of home, was where it opens up, you can go on down, as you can see, to all 102, and there's two more extra inside of that, aside from that, of the classes, and click on any of them, and you will be able to see the class and the slides. Then another place you can see the course is if you go to my own website, johnshatcher.com, and this is the home page for that, and you go to online course at the top tab here, and you will see that the courses are numbered chronologically from the top down. And if you go on down, for example, to the one we did last week, and you click on it, it will go to the class. Now, one thing you may not have noticed, when you look on the class, it says slides here, and you see this whether you go through see the courses on my website or on the YouTube channel. If you click on that link, it will go to the slides so that you can see the slides without the program. In other words, you can simply look at the slides and get the citations and so on without having to pause. And if you go to the left up here where it says File, you can see you can download the entire PowerPoint, either as a PowerPoint or plain text and so on. All right, now let me stop sharing. And if you have any questions about that, let me know, but you can simply go back, since this is being recorded for this class, you can simply go back on this class and see those instructions again. I bring that up simply because last week there was one individual who, for example, wanted to know if we were going to do a class on the Igan, and we will certainly refer to the Igan and passages from the Igan, because the whole purpose of this course is to learn how to read scripture, and some of the more important passages are in the Igan. And of course, the first, I say, of course, let me not say that, because that presumes everybody knows the same thing. There is the first 100 pages or so of the Igan is really a class by Baha'u'llah on how to interpret scripture. It's more than that, but we'll discuss that another time. But he is spending 100 pages to elucidate and interpret the 3 verses from Matthew, I think it's 29 or something like that. I don't know. We don't need to know right now. Let us get started on the class tonight with my sharing my screen again. And this time we will go to the PowerPoint for tonight, and the title, which is Questions to Ask When You Don't Understand. I'm not sure it's the same title I used when I was advertising the program tonight, but you get the idea. It's, in other words, what's the first thing you do when you read a passage and you simply, I don't get it, or you don't get enough of it, or there are parts of it you don't get? Now, before we do that, I've got another thing to catch up on. You remember in the first class, we looked over just a second, let me go back to where I wanted to be. In The Ocean of His Words, a book I wrote, we talked about the fact that when we looked at Baha'u'llah's writings, that Baha'u'llah says in the Surah of the Temple that he has revealed his words in 9 different modes. Now, we could use the word styles, but the idea I came up with in my own consideration of the writings was, well, I could find 9 genres, as we would say in literary study. A genre is simply a category of writing. And you see here the ones I came up with: mystical treatises and poems, lyric modes, and we gave examples: doctrinal essays, gnomic verse or maxims or aphorisms, epistolary mode, which are formal epistles, allegories, then supplications and meditations, prayers in other words, homiletic and oratory works, such as the Tablet of the True Believer, which is a part of the Igan, and legal documents such as those of the Covenant and the Kitabi Agdas. Now, let me go back 2 slides here, because Khotan, a participant in the class last week, mentioned, if you'll remember in the Q&A, that he was aware of a work by the Bab called Five Modes of Revelation, Padshang. I'm not sure that's the correct pronunciation, but you'll forgive me. But the 5 that are mentioned by the Bab of his own revelation are verses, or ayat, and ayat is what we call the verses in the Quran, prayers, munajat, sermons, khutbeh, I guess it is, commentary or tafsir, and tafsir is the same word that Arabic scholars use in interpreting the Quran, and Farsi or Persian styles. Now, in some sense, the last one doesn't seem to be a genre, but simply the works he did in Persian. And I'm not sure, but he may mean something else by that, because I haven't read the work itself, but it's summarized and discussed online. And you can simply Google the Bab's 5 modes and find that on a link to a discussion of this work. So in addition to my idea, there are, as I noted last class, 9 modes proposed by the scholar Janabi Fazl Mazindarani, mentioned by Adi Pehirzadeh in the 4th volume of his, let's see, is that the 4th volume? I'm not sure it is, but page 42 at any rate, and that's probably, oh no, excuse me, it's not 5, it's V1, that means volume 1. So volume 1, page 42 of the Revelation of Baha'u'llah by Adi Pehirzadeh. He quotes Janabi Fazl as listing these 9 categories. Now, what is the importance of this? This may seem a bit afield of what we're trying to do. The importance of it is, one of the reasons we need to be aware of these different modes is that each mode will require some distinctly different, or may require some distinctly different capacity on our part to understand it. And so if we know that the Igan is an essay and very highly structured, then we will approach it differently than we would approach, say, a poem by Baha'u'llah, or the Tablet of the Holy Mariner, or something that's structured quite differently. The Agdas, for example, is, oh, never mind. Let me get to that later. But I'm just trying to make the point that it is valuable to know that there are these different modes, whether they be literary modes or, as Janabi Fazl says, tablets with the tone of command or authority, those with the tone of servitude, meekness, and supplication, writings dealing with interpretation of the old scriptures, religious beliefs, and doctrines of the past, writings in which laws and ordinances have been enjoined for this age and laws of the past abrogated. That would be obviously the Kitabi Agdas. Mystical writings, obviously that would be the Seven Valleys, the Four Valleys, and various other works, particularly as poems. Tablets concerning matters of government and world order, and those addressed to the kings. Certainly the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, as well as the Suri Hakel would come under that category. Tablets dealing with subjects of learning and knowledge, divine philosophy, mysteries of creation, medicine, alchemy, so on. The Tablet of Wisdom might fall into that category. Tablets exhorting men to education, goodly character, and divine virtues. What I call gnomic verse would certainly fall under that. Particularly the tablets written in that book that contains tablets written after the Kitabi Agdas. And then finally, tablets dealing with social teachings. Now, to be frank with you, what I don't like about what Janabi Fazl has done is that they're not parallel. That is, some of these are describing genres, some of them are discussing subject matters. To me, they need to be one thing or the other. So to be frank with you, I prefer my own devising, but it doesn't matter. The point is that we realize that we must, among the questions we're going to ask, ask other questions. And that's what the class tonight is focused on. What questions do we ask when we read something of Baha'u'llah's or Abdul Baha's or the other scriptures from the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, or any other religious scripture? The first thing you want to ask is who is speaking. Now, with the works of Baha'u'llah, you might say, well, Baha'u'llah is speaking. No, that's not always true. In a fictional work he writes, such as the Tablet of the Holy Mariner, he is not the speaker. He is a character in that work, the Holy Mariner. The same thing is true with, for example, the hidden words. Who is speaking? Well, Baha'u'llah. But really, it's the voice of God speaking to us through Baha'u'llah. So in other words, who is the character that is speaking? And if it's Baha'u'llah, in what station is he speaking? As one who is, for example, in prayers and meditations, one who is seeking help from God, one who is commanding us to do things, and so on. And so here are some of the considerations under this question. Is the speaker the composer or a persona? That is a fictional character. Now, this is particularly important when you're reading poetic works, and it's something when I would teach, what I'm teaching you tonight or trying to convey to you, and in most of the classes we're going to have in this sequence, are come from a sequence of courses I taught. One was a course on a graduate seminar level on modern poetry. Another was in an undergraduate class called Understanding Poetry. And I would go over these same things because, for example, you read a poem by Wordsworth and you say, well, that's Wordsworth. He's up in the Lake Country and he's thinking about this or that. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes it'll be a fictional character. And if you assume, for example, in the Coleridge's rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, well, that's not Coleridge, that's a character he's created. So it's always important to ask, is this the composer of the work, or is this a character the composer has created? Is this a male or female? In other words, you want to ask basic questions about this character. How old is this person? What revealing tips are there in the passage that the passage gives me that should be? Other clues about the background and age. In other words, what hints does the speaker give about the speaker's condition? Where is this occurring or taking place? Where is the speaker? And that can be in, where is the speaker in a place? For example, is Baha'u'llah talking when he's in the Siyachal or someplace else? It's important for us to know that. What time in the day or what time in the speaker's life? That's important to know. Is the passage focused on this character or on another character or object? In other words, is the persona or speaker simply a means whereby we see something else? Are we seeing reality through that character's eyes? And the focus is really on something else? Or is the ultimate focus on the character himself or herself? Now, I don't expect you to remember these, but we're going to utilize these tools. So look upon this class and several of the classes that are going to follow as tools that I have over the course of teaching at various levels accumulated that I find useful in learning how to unseal, if you will, or unveil the various levels of meaning in a work. What is the setting? Now, some of this is going to overlap. When is the passage written? What time of day, time of year, time of life, time in history? Where is this passage written? Again, with Coleridge, when he lines written above Tintern Abbey, well, he tells you this is important. I'm writing this in a particular time in my life at a particular place, and I'm recollecting what my life has been like. What is the cultural perspective? Now, a lot of, well, not a lot, some scholars have thought it apt to read the writings of Baha'u'llah with consideration or through the lens of the fact that he is writing as a Persian in a certain, with a certain cultural perspective and certain biases. Well, we know that's not true if we understand the nature of the manifestation. He is writing in a context, and he makes you aware of that context, but he's capable of writing outside the constraints of any context. So, and yet, on the other hand, there are cultural allusions and things worth knowing. So, for example, when he says we shouldn't put our hands in the food, dig the food out with our hands, as one of the rules of etiquette in the, I guess we may, what is he talking about? Well, if you've seen pictures of the various mullahs and so on, sitting around a big bowl. And of course, it's all men together, no women there. And they go in and reach in and grab the food. He says that's not allowed anymore. What country or place? What physical setting? For example, it's interesting to know that when he revealed the tablet of the Holy Mariner, Baha'u'llah was in the country on an outing with his followers, and he had Mir Zaka Jan come out of the tent, the most holy tabernacle, and recite the tablet of the Holy Mariner, and all the joy and fellowship they were enjoying suddenly came to an end because they realized that something dire was about to happen. And of course, before they were finished, the messenger came saying that the governor needed to meet with Baha'u'llah to inform him that he had been exiled. Who is the intended audience? Is the work to a specific individual? Now, of course, all of the works of Baha'u'llah are for all of us, but he will almost all of his works are written to or someone or in response to a question someone has posed to him. So, for example, as I pointed out in a class many classes ago, the Tablet of Wisdom is written to a particular individual whom he praises at the end of the work for having asked the questions. And he says, because you have asked that, you are honored because you have enabled everyone else to receive the benefit of the answer. The whole of the Igan is an answer to 5 questions put to Baha'u'llah by the as yet unconverted uncle of the Bab. So it's important to know this. If so, then what is the character and status of the recipient? Now, we talked about this a lot in the last classes when we were dealing with the work. We talked about how the irony in some cases where he would be writing, well, we'll deal with this when we deal with it, but suffice it to say, it's important to know, is he writing something to someone he knows is rebellious or is going to rebel? Is he writing to someone who is faithful, who's going through tests or is about to go through tests and so on? That will inform us about the work. Even if it is written on behalf of or at the bequest of another, what am I supposed to learn from this as regards my character or life choices? To what extent is the audience determined by historical context? So as I said, in one sense, the writings of Baha'u'llah exceed any cultural constraints or any historical constraints to a certain extent, but they don't really, in the sense that he's saying this is the beginning of a new era and a new cycle, and here's what's going to happen in this cycle. So the historical context of Baha'i history and the future as described in the Baha'i writings is extremely important, very relevant to history of the past, what it has led to, the big question of, if God wants us to be spiritual, why aren't we? If God wants history to lead us to a spiritual advancement, why aren't we? What happens in this passage? Now, this may seem very general, very broad, but what I'm talking about is always something happens. It may not be a specific course of action that is described. Sometimes there is. For example, in the letter to the Shah, Baha'u'llah says, I was asleep upon my couch. I was like someone asleep upon my couch, when lo, the breezes swept over me and so forth. And I attained this knowledge. So that's something happening physically or spiritually. So it may not be a physical action, but it may be there's some kind of action that takes place always. Where are the sentences? Now, this is something that we could spend at least a couple of classes on, but it is important for you to know that even with poetry, there are sentences. They may be implicit rather than explicit, but all communication is written in sentences. And we'll get to that as we go along. But if you're having trouble understanding something, find out where the subject is, find out where the verb is. If there is an object of the verb, find that. In other words, you have to read the writings in terms of sentences. That's the way to get unstuck. Is the action mental or physical or both? Is the passage structured according to a sequence of events? Is the whole work, in fact, part of a sequence of events? Is there any change of importance? Is there some major course of events that take place? If we go back to what I was mentioning about the tablet to the Shah, of course, the important information is he's telling the Shah, there came a point in my life when I had this power and authority that it began. And so I'm not doing this for my own benefit or on my own instigation or inspiration, but by the inspiration of God. in the speaker, in someone else, in me. And then by that, I mean, do you feel something happen in you, or does Baha'u'llah or whoever the author is expect something to happen in you? And of course, we relate to that in most of the hidden words. 5, what is the tone of the passage or emotional tenor of the speaker? Now, there are two words that are often confused in talking about understanding and reading literature. One is the tone that we'll talk about here, and then the next is the mood. Now, you might think they're the same, but they're not. The tone is the manner or emotional tenor with which the speaker is speaking. So, for example, as I say here, does the speaker have a detectable attitude? Is the speaker angry? Is the speaker in sorrow, and so on? So the tone of the speaker is important to discern. And of course, with Baha'u'llah, the tone will often change from one thing to another. Sometimes he'll be angry. Sometimes he'll be humorous. Sometimes he'll be very ironic. Sometimes he will be stern. So it's important to catch the tone with which he is speaking and where it changes. Is the speaker happy or sad? Is the speaker sarcastic, ironic, or humorous? And then the mood. Now, the mood is that which, that character of or quality of emotion produced by the passage. So the speaker may be speaking with a tone of anger, but it evokes in you some other kind of emotion, such as fear or a sense of justice, or depends on, again, what effect it has on you as to what the mood will produce in you. Does the passage have a detectable emotion connoted? How do I feel after reading the passage? What contribution do particular words have on creating this effect? That's very important. The key words, the emotionally charged words in a work, and finding them. It's not hard to do. Particularly in the words that are more poetic and so on. What impact do the sound effects have on the passage? Now, that's the last thing we will become aware of when we're reading something, most usually, unless you are a writer or a reader of poetry and you're very attuned to sound effects. You may not be aware of the effects it's having on you. But the more you become aware of the sound effects, the more you understand what kind of sound effects that words can produce, the more they will begin to affect you, and the more you will begin to appreciate them, particularly, I must say, in, say, the prayers that Shoghi Effendi translated. He is, fortunately, he was an incredible writer of prose and poetry. And so the translation of the hidden words, for example, is so beauteous. And this, you see, there's a problem. And that is, you can't, let's see, Shiri Sharafi.
Hi, John. Yes. May I say something?
You may say something.
Thank you. Just about what you just said, you read my mind pretty much, that The Guardian in his writings has taken all of these things that you were just mentioning into account and has implemented them so beautifully in his translations of the writings to give us that exact feeling that, for instance, we would get in the Arabic or the Persian writings of Baha'u'llah. And The Guardian, as you mentioned, was such an incredible writer. If it was a prayer or if it was a book that he was translating, really, really gave us that whole everything that you just mentioned.
Well, thank you. Yes, that's exactly what I'm getting at. Thank you very much. You may not, and probably are not, familiar with the sound effects. They are different sound effects in different languages. For example, I speak Spanish. Well, Spanish is very rhythmical. It doesn't have inflected, it does have inflected endings. English does not. So it's very hard to do an effective rhyme in English. In fact, most modern poets, beginning at the turn of the past century, of the 20th century, stopped using rhyme in modern English poetry because it became sort of sing-songy. It became obnoxious, or they felt it interfered with the poetry, because English does not rhyme well. Why? Because around 600 to 700 AD, English lost its endings, and the endings are what make a language easy or hard to rhyme. So Spanish is easy to rhyme because it has the inflected endings. Inflection means you have certain endings for verbs, for nouns. You have conjugation of verbs that have certain endings, and so on. So there are two kinds of sound that are particularly noticeable when you're reading poetic works: meter, or rhythm, and the other is sound on sound, where a sound bounces off of or relates to another sound. Does it have a rhyme scheme? Now, that's very true in, say, the earlier English works, such as a Shakespearean sonnet. And yet the best Shakespearean sonnets, you don't notice the rhyme schemes. And I'll use a specific term here that doesn't mean anything to you, because they're not in rhyme. They use enjambment, and we'll talk about that another time. Now, they do rhyme in Persian or in Arabic, but in order to try to make that happen in English, you're going to have to totally change and I've seen people try it, and it's terrible. It doesn't work well, hardly ever. Now, there are a couple of short verses where this was done originally in the original translation of the Seven Valleys and Four Valleys, where Baha'u'llah quotes Hafiz or Rumi, and they're not bad. They're in quatrains or something, and they will use a meter, not the meter of the original, but an English meter. They're not terrible. That's the best I can say about them. But you can't translate the rhyme scheme most often from Farsi or from Arabic into English, and you do ill to try. What other sound effects does it have? For example, assonance, the repetition of a vowel sound. Dissonance, a mingling of sounds that strikes the ear harshly, but on purpose, so that the clashing of sounds that befits the mood you're trying to create. A mingling of discordant sounds. Alliteration, which is very common, and this is where you, instead of with assonance, you have vowel sounds that are repeated, similar vowel sounds. With alliteration, you have consonantal repetition, the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning, adjacent or closely to connected words, and they're usually consonants, and that's exactly what consonants is, just another type of alliteration. Internal rhyme, which is simply what it says, where you don't have end rhyme, where you have a rhyme scheme, but words that rhyme within the line. So instead of at the end of a line, a rhyme involving a word in the middle of a line or another at the end of the line, in the middle of the next line, and so on. But you notice them. Then we're going to experiment with that tonight, just a very little bit, as much as we have time for. So the next question: are there noteworthy symbols in the work? Well, how do you know if it's a symbol unless you know how to recognize symbols? And we'll talk about that. But usually you can. you know that that doesn't make sense on the literal level. So something is used symbolic. And there's symbols, of course, that are, many of them are culturally based, like Mashriq al-Azkar. There's the whole symbolic nature of the house of worship, or the divine lote tree, or the what is the symbol of the lote tree? Well, that becomes so common to you that you don't have to think about it anymore, and so on. But we'll come across a lot of those. If there are, how do I decipher them? That's something we're going to spend the next class on. How do you decipher a symbol or a metaphor or a simile or other figures of speech? What are some obvious meanings? What is the referent? Referent means, what is the symbol referring to? For example, if you see a red sign with stop on it, you know that means stop. And the referent is to the mode of action. But if you see a flag of a foreign country, you may not know what that country is unless you know why it is configured the way it is. And then you say, oh, I understand now how that represents that country. How do I go about uncovering the illusion? What processes, what keys are there to discovering what it is alluding to and how it came? One thing that's interesting, how did it come to allude to that? Why does red mean stop and green mean go? What's the origin of that symbol? The lote tree, or the tree of life, and so on, that's used in so many cultures and so many religions. So we know it has a specific meaning in the Baha'i writings, but it also has meanings in other literature as well. Are there analogical devices? And we're going to go over that next time. What is an analogy? That's an equivalence. An analogy is a comparison, but it's an implicit rather than an explicit comparison. For example, the story of Adam and Eve is a parable, is, according to Abdu'l-Baha, is an analogy. And we'll discuss that when we go into the Old Testament scriptures. What does it mean? What does Abdu'l-Baha say it means? What are some other possible meanings? Because he says this is one meaning, but there are many others. Well, let's see if we can find some others. Metaphors, similes, analogies. Now, and this is the final one. This is what is the intended meaning? And that's such an important phrase. When we're doing translation work, and I've done a lot of it in a couple of languages, you're interested more not in what you can make it mean, but what the intent of the author is in the meaning of this. So, for example, when we look at the Suri Heiko and study that work, as I did in my book, The Body of God, my purpose, and I don't know if I achieved it or not, but my purpose was trying to figure out what is Baha'u'llah trying to do with this symbol? It's so replete with symbols. What does he mean? So I'm not trying to figure out what can I make it mean, but what is his intention with this passage? Regardless of what I may understand or derive from this passage, how does it relate to the overall theme of the work? Whatever I think the meaning of the passage is, or meaning of the work as a whole, what do I think the author's intended meaning is? The author's intended meaning. Now we're going to, just to finish up, we're going to look at a work here and apply some of these tools that are questions. Well, why do we need to take this apart? We all know what it means, but it's still valuable in a lot of ways. So if I had you as an undergraduate student or a graduate student write an essay on this, it would probably take you a good 10 pages to do a decent job. If you describe the meter, the rhyme scheme, if you describe the sound effects, if you described the point of view, the persona, all of these things that we just went over. So let's do a couple of them just to give you an idea of some of the things we're going to be doing. Well, obviously, the speaker on this is probably not the poet. It is a poet describing how a child would view a star in the sky, especially if the child in these days rarely gets to see a star because all the ambient light that interferes with our ability to see the stars with clarity. But if you've ever gone into a place where there is no light around and you feel like you're part of the heavens, I may have mentioned before that I remember when I was in the desert one time, how just overwhelming it was, but there was still some ambient light in the desert. But when I was on top of the Adirondacks in New York, or it's one of the Adirondack Mountains, it was just amazing. There was no ambient light whatsoever. And so I could not tell the difference between the ground and the sky. And it was like I was part of it. But you look at that with amazement. And if a child looks at it for the first time, they are struck with wonder, particularly if it is a sparkling star, or if it may be a star or a sun, in effect, or it may be another celestial object. So the child looks at it. I wonder what you are, up above the world so high. And so the child compares it. And so this is what we call a simile, because it's explicit rather than implicit. That is, it's explicitly compared. You are like a diamond in the sky. And we think, well, that's not a very imaginative one. But for a child, it is, because the child may have seen a diamond on his or her mother's wedding ring or something, and where you have all of these various refractions and reflections of light as the diamond shows the different colors of the white light that is shining into it and refracts it back at you. Well, enough on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. My point is, even the simplest poem, if it's decent, is worth thinking about creatively and using these tools. I want to end tonight with one that we will look at a lot more detail when we get to the Old Testament. And this is the 23rd Psalm. It's one with which you're probably familiar, often recited and also learned by children. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And this is the King James Version. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Beautiful, beautiful. But it's not so simple. Now, who is the speaker? Well, it's not the manifestation. It's not David, if this is a psalm written by David. It is a sheep. It is a sheep speaking about the Lord and comparing the Lord to his shepherd. I shall not want. I shall not need anything, because he is going to lead me where I will have green pastures and still waters where I can drink. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness. Now, suddenly it shifts from the sheep. In other words, we know that this individual is thinking of himself as a sheep, because we're not aware that a sheep thinks about its soul and so forth. But then it goes back to it. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Well, the shepherd has two things, and this reminds me very much of Baha'u'llah's statement that justice is the justice is substantiated or upheld by two forces, reward and punishment. And so the rod and the staff represent those two forces. If the sheep gets in trouble, the shepherd will use the staff with the crook on it to pull the sheep out of the bramble, or if it's fallen off a cliff or something, it can rescue it. The rod is to sort of tap the sheep on the rear end to get along. So one is to help the sheep advance, the other is to save the sheep. So these two sources of assistance and encouragement. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Well, who are the enemies of the sheep? Well, the enemies of the sheep, of course, would be wolves and so forth, and they may see, but the shepherd is there to protect it. Thou anointest my head with oil. Well, this has been interpreted various ways, but one of them is that if you own farm animals, you know that sometimes you have to put oil on their forehead that has insecticide in it to keep the flies off of them. And this was probably what this is alluding to. My cup runneth over. The cup in this case could be interpreted many ways. I would say it's probably the cup of kindness if he's being metaphorical, or it could be literally the cup of sustenance, insofar as water or whatever. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord. Now it shifts back again to the persona. So it is literally, or poetically, it is a sheep talking. But of course, metaphorically, it is an individual who looks upon the Lord as his shepherd, who will never leave him without comfort. And if he follows the commands and allows him to rescue him, then he will always dwell in the house of the Lord. And so on. We could discuss this a lot, but you get the idea that all is not what it seems. This seems like a very simple thing, and it is to a certain extent. But it's nice to know something about how sheep were kept back in the day when this was written. And so you can understand the analogy, the poetic nature of the song. Here's one from Baha'u'llah. Thou art, and this is a hidden word, and notice the Persian, as we said last time, the Persian hidden words are poetic, the Arabic hidden words are very straightforward, and we said why. O my servant, thou art even as a finely tempered sword, concealed in the darkness of its sheath, and its value hidden from the artificer's knowledge. Wherefore come forth from the sheath of self and desire, that thy worth may be resplendent and manifest unto all the world. Okay, here you have God, or Baha'u'llah speaking, in the as God among men, saying to us that are to someone a servant. And of course, it's very important that we pay attention in the hidden words to whom he is speaking, who is the audience. Well, this is my servant. And is this positive or negative? Well, thou art like a finely tempered. What is a tempered sword? Well, a tempered sword, of course, is a sword that has been prepared for battle. It's not a decorative sword. It's been finely tempered in the heat, and then cooled and heated and cooled until it's so hard that it will not be broken. But this sword is not being used. It's hidden in the darkness of the sheath, and therefore its value as a weapon or as some use for some other purpose is hidden from the purpose that for which it was intended. The artificer. Now, what's the artificer? An artificer is the one who makes the sword, the fashioner of the sword. So it's, in effect, its value is being concealed because it's not being used. It should come out of the sheath. And notice what the sheath is explained. What does the sheath represent? Self. So because we have certain capacities that we have been given, but if we hide them in the sheath of self, instead of using them for the purpose they were intended by the artificer, the one who made us, so that the world may be made better, then we are useless. So again, not terribly complicated, but still well worth the discussion. And this is a very wonderful exercise to do, and perhaps some of you have done it, is to sit around with 2 or 3 or 4 people, not too many, but not too few, and have each person give their idea of, well, what might this be and what might that be? Or I thought this meant this, or how does it make you feel? Knowing that these words have many levels of meaning. There's not one final meaning that it has. But what you're looking for is, but what does Baha'u'llah intend for me to get out of this? What is his intended meaning?